10 spot, we have the aggressive girl. When this storyteller was younger, she was put into a psych ward after threatening to take her own life. She had only been in there one day before this incident happened. She was sitting on her bed just reading when, all of a sudden, she heard screaming in the halls. Then, less than a minute later, a girl in her 20s or so kicked down her door and was just staring at her with a devilish look and a sharp object in her hand. The storyteller sat there frozen looking at the girl when all of a sudden 2 bodyguards tackled the devilish girl to the ground. The girl was then dragged away and put into the quiet room. When the doctor came in, they told the patient that all was well and asked her if she wanted to still take her own life. The girl said nope, and she was then released one day later. In our number 9 spot, we have no friends. When this storyteller was a med student and he was shadowing a resident and doing psych clerkship, he came across a patient who had been struggling with schizophrenia and with hearing voices in his head. The resident he was shadowing asked him what the voices would say to him, and he didn't want to answer the question. Apparently, he was then offered some meds to make the voices go away, and he didn't want to take them. When the resident asked him why he didn't want to take them, he replied that they were his only friends. In our number 8 spot, we have the lollipop. This is a story told by a nurse that worked in a ward and was being informed about a new patient that had been checked in. This is a patient that was being treated for many problems, but learning about his history really freaked her out. Apparently, one day he wanted a lollipop from his mom and she wouldn't give him one. So he decided to purposely drown his toddler brother because she refused. When the nurse got a good look at the patient, she said it was like there was no life behind his eyes. He was stark cold and terrifying. No humanity was left.
Up next, in at number 7, we have the tongue biter. A patient who tested positive for HIV and paranoid schizophrenia thought that the nurses at the psych ward were all trying to kill him. So as a way to protect himself, he would bite his tongue and spit HIV positive blood into their faces and try to get it into their mouth. Well, this actually sounds so damn terrifying. Whenever the nurses had to interact with him, they had to wear full masks, gowns, gloves in order to protect themselves. Yeah, this is absolutely insane. I bet his tongue is so damaged from him constantly biting himself. This sounds like the worst patient ever. We have another horror story coming onto this list in at number 6. Penhurst Asylum is located in Pennsylvania and it was opened in 1908. This was a hospital for children, but it was barely staffed and it was poorly funded. So this led to a lot of overworked, desperate staff members who used a lot of cruel and unusual punishments. A lot of children were drugged, they were chained to their beds, isolated for days, and they had their teeth ripped out of their gums to prevent biting. A reporter went into the insane asylum to investigate how the workers were treating the patients, and in 1968 it was finally shut down. But the fun doesn't stop there. It is believed that this place is still haunted by upset children who were abused there. If you enter the doors, you can actually hear some screaming, you can hear doors being slammed, and uncontrollable crying. Number 5 takes us to the Waverly Hills Sanitarium. The insane asylum was built in 1910, and this was the place where patients with tuberculosis would go to get some treatment. But they had no idea what was in store for them. Doctors at the hospital carried out painful experimental surgeries as a way to treat the disease. They would insert balloons into their lungs, and they also tried removing ribs in order to allow the lungs to expand. Yeah, I can safely say that none of these surgery techniques are being used today because they're absolutely insane. It's crazy, it's ludicrous. Maybe the doctor should have been admitted to the hospital because they were absolutely crazy. As a result of these surgeries, 64,000 patients died, and one of the employees hanged herself in the laundry room because she couldn't tolerate how the patients were being treated. The corpses would then be transported out of the morgue through a body chute, and a lot of the original building is actually still intact today. Slicing into number 4, we have the Metropolitan State Hospital. They opened their doors in 1930, and even though it was supposed to be a safe haven for children with mental health issues, it was more like like a prison. Children would be heavily sedated on a constant basis, and they would be severely disciplined. In 1978, there was a patient named Anna Marie Davy, and one day she went out for a walk, but she never returned. 2 years later, another patient confessed to the brutal murder, and he brought the police to 3 separate graves where he had buried parts of her mutilated body. And if that wasn't gruesome enough, he even kept 7 of her teeth tucked away in his room just as a souvenir. I mean, how the hell does a murder in a hospital even happen? He got away with murdering her, cutting up her body, and digging 3 separate graves. Someone definitely wasn't very good at their jobs, otherwise he would have been caught a lot sooner, or that girl wouldn't have been murdered. Things get pretty gruesome in at number 3 with Topeka State Hospital. The hospital opened its doors back in 1872 for the medically and criminally insane. For nearly 100 years, they closed their doors because there were so many reports of abuse and murder. During its operational days, Topeka State Hospital was infamous for their elaborate and brutal treatments. They used to force their patients to become sterile. They used hydrotherapy and castration. A lot of the patients were starved to death, or they would be left in a tub of ice cold water for days. Some of them would be tied to trees, and they would be left for hours and hours. It's no wonder why the patients who were admitted here just keep getting more and more insane. Next up, number 2, we have the arm eater. A woman with a personality disorder was moved into a new room for closer monitoring, and that's because she was at a high risk of harming herself. This 30-year-old woman was struggling with mental issues ever since she was 8 years old. During Christmas time, she started to really struggle with her health because it was a really tough time for her. So she began to bite herself. And I'm not talking about just digging her teeth into, a little bit of skin. She would actually grab her arm with her teeth and tear flesh away. And we're talking like huge pieces. I don't want to get too graphic on you guys. It's pretty crazy. She would then chew it and then And she said that a voice in her head told her to do it. Patient gouges out their own eyes brings us to number 1, because why not? I came across this story on Reddit, and it was written by Never Got Challenger. This story is about their mother who used to work at a neuropsychiatric ward while she was in grad school. One night while she was performing her routine checks, she stumbled upon the most gruesome and horrific scene of her life. During the night shift, all the patients' bedroom doors are normally closed, but one room was different. As she turned the corner, she noticed that one of the rooms were open, and she saw someone's leg on the floor. When she looked inside of the room, she saw a patient who had just gouged both of her own eyes out with her bare hands. She was just on the floor holding her bloody eyes. I mean, is this real life right now?
Starting off this countdown, we have Rolling Hills Asylum. Established in 1827, the Rolling Hills Asylum was originally a working farm that was converted into a home for the less fortunate. Then it went on to be a place for widows, orphans, alcoholics, criminals, and individuals with mental illnesses. But it closed its doors in 1974. Apparently, it's said that over 1,700 people died there. Hundreds are currently buried all over the property in unmarked graves, which makes this place very haunted. Visitors claim to have heard screaming and doors slamming. Others have seen the apparition of Roy Cruz, a 7.5-foot tall man who died there in 1942. And the hospital even has something known as a shadow hallway, a hallway where you can see tons of ghostly apparitions. Moving on to number 9, we have Topeka State Hospital. The Topeka State Hospital, located in Kansas, operated from 1872 to 1997. And this hospital, much like the others on this list, has quite a dark history. So apparently in the early 20th century, a reporter visited the facility and witnessed some terrifying things. He said that he saw a patient that had been strapped down for so long that his skin was growing over the restraints, and there were other patients that were chained up like animals. But a majority of them just sat in the hallways on a rocking chair, rocking back and forth, staring at the walls all day. That's something straight out of a horror film. In our 8th spot, we have the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum began operating in 1964 and was designed to only hold 250 patients. However, it was soon housing more than 2,400 patients, which was very problematic. The place was extremely overcrowded, and patients started to become more and more violent. Soon they were starting fires and attacking the staff.
In 1994, the asylum was forced to close due to a lot of violations. Now it's said that the building is haunted from the souls of the mistreated patients. In fact, the building is open to ghost tours if you want to go do some exploring.
At number 7 is Denbigh, the abandoned insane asylum in North Wales. Built between 1944 and 1948, Denbigh was meant to be a sanctuary for around 200 patients from Wales. But as demand surged, it expanded its walls to contain up to a staggering 1,500 souls at its peak. Now things would eventually take a dark turn. We're talking prefrontal lobotomy. Over 20 unfortunate patients underwent this procedure between 1942 and 1944. Tragically, one even lost their life. And if that wasn't grim enough, reports suggest that violent patients found themselves in cages. Flash forward to the 1960s and the asylum's infamy caught up with it. Enoch Powell, a British member of parliament, pulled the plug on Daneberg's operation. But it kept haunting until 1995 when its doors finally closed for good. At number 6 is the Hagedorn Psychiatric Hospital, nestled on Sanatorium Road in New Jersey, USA. Originally constructed in 1907 as a tuberculosis sanatorium, Hagedorn, I don't really know, this place aimed to treat only the curable. Over the years, its mission expanded to include those deemed incurable, and by 1929, about 10,000 patients had sought care here. Fast forward to the 1970s and the hospital fell into disrepair and was abandoned, and a new psychiatric facility was erected nearby. This extension catered to elderly patients with mental illnesses, but the winds of change blew strong. The shift away from institutionalization led to Hagedorn's official closure in 2012. Now abandoned, Hagedorn stands as a somber reminder of an era when care methods were vastly different. These silent corridors echo with the stories of those who live within, a testament to the progress we've made in mental health care. At number 5 is the Willard Asylum for the Chronically Insane in New York, USA. Built in 1869, this cutting-edge facility held a gymnasium, arts and crafts, a movie theater, and even a bowling alley aimed to provide a haven for those with mental illnesses to recover and reintegrate into society. But sadly, like its other counterparts, overcrowding stifled its mission, subjecting patients to archaic treatments like electroshock therapy and ice baths. The hospital's doors closed in 1995, but its legacy lives on through the haunting discovery of hundreds of suitcases belonging to forgotten patients. These personal artifacts tell the stories of lives once lost in the shadows, now brought to light by the Willard Suitcase Project. At number 4, and I'm totally gonna butcher this, is the Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra, the abandoned insane asylum in Italy. Established in 1888, this asylum was meant to be a haven for patients with mental illnesses. Dr. Luigi Scabbia expanded it into a village, complete with shops, gardens, and even a judicial section. However, its idyllic vision was lost as it became overcrowded with over 6,000 patients by the year 1960. Sadly, conditions here were far from ideal. Patients were treated like prisoners, subjected to electroshock, insulin-induced comas, and ice-tanked submersions. The asylum's dark history persisted until 1978 when the Basaglia law mandated its closure, finally ending the suffering. Today, the abandoned asylum stands as a somber reminder of its past. Among the decaying walls, you can still find the haunting artwork of Fernando Orcerte Nanetti, a patient who left his mark with intricate graffiti that depicted the experiences and abuses he witnessed. At number 3 is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, USA. Opening its doors back in 1983, this asylum was the brainchild of Thomas Kirkpaid, a mental health practitioner who believed in providing patients with a supportive environment for their recovery. Originally embodying reformist ideals, the asylum boasted spacious halls, private rooms, and even outdoor facilities like a farm and waterworks. But as time went on, a sinister shift occurred. Overcrowding took hold with patient numbers far exceeding capacity. Quality care plummeted, leaving patients to fend for themselves amidst the deteriorating conditions. What's truly disturbing, however, is the treatments administered here. Dr. Walter Freeman, infamous for his ice pick lobotomy method, performed around 4,000 of these chilling procedures within these walls, which involved an ice pick through the eye socket. The horrors within these walls came to light in the bombshell expose in 1949, revealing the disturbing conditions. Yet the asylum staggered on, only closing its doors for good in 1994. Today, visitors can explore the remnants of its haunting history. The main building now hosts exhibits showcasing patient art and the tools of their torment. For those brave enough, paranormal tours await, offering a spine-chilling glimpse into the secrets that still echo within these forsaken halls. At number 2 is the Beechworth Lunatic Asylum in Victoria, Australia. Back in October of 1867, this sprawling institution emerged atop a hill, driven by a peculiar belief that a higher altitude could cure mental illness, housing over 1,200 patients and boasting a staff of 700 at its zenith. But the treatments here were anything but gentle. We're talking straitjackets, shackles, and electroshock therapy, a common practice that led to mass shock sessions. Now it's no wonder that this place was believed to be haunted even after its closure in 1995. For example, meet Martin Sharp, a compassionate soul from the past. Rumor has it that her spirit still lingers, casting chilling auras as she watches over patients. Nurses have shared eerie tales of her presence, recounting a sudden drop in temperature when she's around. And brace yourself, other ghostly figures have been cited by brave visitors during haunted tours, preserving the asylum's unsettling legacy that endures even now, more than 150 years later. At number 1 is the State Asylum in Pennsylvania, USA, where healing turned into horror. Established in 1903 as a haven for the mentally ill, it quickly spiraled into overcrowded chaos. Unqualified staff struggled to care for patients, leading to shocking violence between them. In 1919, 2 staff members confessed to strangling a patient, yet they were bizarrely kept on staff. The violence continued with horrifying discoveries over the years. Unthinkable medical experiments also took place, reportedly by a pharmaceutical company. This house of horrors finally came to light in a 1946 expose and was deemed a nightmare in the 1980s. And despite several closure attempts, the asylum's doors finally shut for good in 1990. Today it stands abandoned, a grim reminder of the darkness that once echoed within.
In our number 10 spot, we have Miss Louise. Miss Louise was an older patient in an asylum who would often sleep talk, but this wasn't your ordinary sleep talking. Her eyes would every so often open, and sometimes she would be sitting up. Oh, terrifying. She wouldn't remember anything that happened when she awoke, which made witnessing her even creepier. Apparently, she has spoken about people who were once there, including a guy who had passed away, and a girl that hangs around her, and her dead husband who is always looking out for her. One of the nurses recalled a time when Miss Louise was sleep talking and she heard her saying, "Shh, better not talk too loudly. They're all sleeping. Let's talk about it later." Wild and creepy and cool at the same time. Coming up at our number 9 spot, we have Possessed Jane. There was once a woman named Jane who lived at a facility. On her first night at the facility, she was found in a pile of blood. Apparently, she had been cutting her skin around her shin with her fingernails and was pulling her skin up her leg. I may be sick. Apparently, she had a very methodical approach to her nighttime routine, going every night to each corner of her room and drawing the cross on the walls. Apparently, one night Jane was screaming late into the night, and when the night nurse went to ask her what was wrong, she responded, "What makes you think you are speaking to Jane?" Creepy. In our number 8 spot, we have the CIA test patient. Apparently, the person who is telling this story once had a very long conversation with a man from a mental facility, and this man claimed that the CIA was beaming thoughts into his head. Apparently, even though this seems like a crazy thought, he made a very interesting point. The man said that if the CIA were going to test products that could send ideas or thoughts into another person's head, of course they're going to use the people that the public already deems as crazy. Then no one would believe them even if they mentioned it. Not to mention they're already confined and being observed. They therefore make the best test subjects. Yeah. Whoa, that's such a good point.
In our 7th spot, we have the Metropolitan State Hospital. Located in Massachusetts, this hospital opened in 1930 for patients with mental illnesses. But in 1980, something sinister happened that gave the hospital the nickname the Hospital of Seven Teeth. So back in 1978, a patient named Anna Marie Davey went out for a walk on the grounds, but she never returned. In 1980, the patient Melvin Wilson came forward saying that he had killed her and buried her body parts all around the grounds. Not only that, he kept 7 of her teeth as souvenirs. Hence the nickname, the Hospital of Seven Teeth. But that's not the only bad thing to happen there. Years before this incident, in the 1960s, a bunch of patients were accidentally poisoned, but this has never been confirmed. In 1992, the hospital was closed after psychiatric care in Massachusetts became more privatized. In our 6th spot, we have Rancho Los Amigos. In 1888, Rancho Los Amigos, located close to downtown LA, was originally created to assist people living in poverty. Over time, the hospital expanded and was home to the elderly, homeless, and individuals with disabilities. But over the years, it ended up changing to become mainly a mental hospital. The hospital was in full operation until the 1950s, when it started to shut down its wards, including the mental hospital. That's when they discovered the hospital had a more dark past. In 2006, after the hospital was abandoned, a freezer was discovered in the morgue. Inside of it were mummified, amputated limbs, and brain tissue samples. Guess they didn't want to take that with them. But this makes you wonder what really went down in this hospital. The original building is now abandoned, but it has moved to another location and is now called Rancho Los Amigos National Rehabilitation Center. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Back in 1912, this hospital opened up in Queens, New York for individuals that were said to be mentally ill. Most of the patients had psychosis or schizophrenia. It started off as a small institution with only 32 patients, but in 1959 it housed more than 7,000 patients. As a result, the hospital was very crowded and understaffed. In the 1970s, rumors spread like wildfire about murders, attacks, and suicides all happening in the hospital. In fact, it's said that one nurse hit a patient in a straitjacket across the throat with a club, which ended up crushing his throat, and as a result he died from asphyxiation. Shortly after, the asylum was closed and left to rot. Making our way down the list, number 4, we have the Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. This next abandoned hospital is named one of the most haunted places in South Korea, and one of the freakiest places in the world. In fact, it's home to tons of urban legends. One legend states that the owner of the hospital was insane and kept the patients as his prisoners. Another version of the legend states that patients at the hospital started dying mysteriously, and that's what forced the hospital to close. In reality, the hospital closed in the 90s due to unsanitary conditions and lack of funding. Apparently because of this, the owner left the country, leaving no documentation behind about this building, so it was just abandoned. But to this day, people are convinced that the hospital is haunted. In fact, thousands of people break into the hospital each year just for the chance to catch a ghost. In our 3rd spot, we have the Zelda Fitzgerald Sanatorium. Built in 1859, this sanatorium, once called Tioranda, was originally built for the Civil War officer General Joseph Howland. Then in 1915 it was converted into a psychiatric hospital. In 1934, novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald took his wife Zelda there with hopes to cure her schizophrenia, hence why people now refer to it as the Zelda Fitzgerald Sanatorium. However, it is probably most known for housing the patient Frances Seymour, aka actress Jane Fonda's mother. Frances ended up taking her own life there after cutting her throat with a razor in 1942. In 1999, the hospital closed and of course is now said to be haunted. In our 2nd spot, we have Athens Lunatic Asylum. Yes, that's the actual name of this asylum. Located in Athens, Ohio, the asylum was built in 1874 for patients with tuberculosis. However, over the years it became way too overcrowded and understaffed. As a result, patients were being mistreated. Over the years, the hospital turned into a place for the mentally ill. This is when the man Dr. Walter Jackson comes into play. Dr. Jackson loved transorbital lobotomies. He believed that it could cure all mental illnesses. So at this hospital, he performed 200 lobotomies. I'm telling you right now that many did not go so well. But that's not the only freaky thing to happen there. A patient known as Margaret Schilling went missing while in the ward. A month later, her body was found locked in a room in an abandoned section of a ward. In fact, her decaying body left a nasty stain on the ward's floor that can still be seen today. And in our number 1 spot, we have Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Located in Kentucky, this hospital was originally built in 1910 as a hospital for patients with tuberculosis. Sadly, tons of patients ended up dying from the disease. The hospital did more harm than good. Rumor goes that the hospital was mistreating their patients and conducting experiments on them. In fact, they had an area in the hospital called the death tunnel or body chute, where they would dump the deceased. It's also said that one nurse hung herself in room 502, and in that same room, another nurse died from falling out of the window. The hospital closed in 1961 upon the discovery of an antibiotic that could treat and cure tuberculosis. As a result, there was no need for the hospital. Now it's said that it's an extremely haunted building. Apparently, people have seen tons of apparitions there. The most famous one being of a boy named Timmy, who likes to play with rubber balls. He also likes to run from room to room. It's said that if you roll a small ball down a hallway, then Timmy will roll it back to you. Also, why are all ghosts either named like Timmy or Tommy? That's what I need to know.
At number 10 is the Willard Asylum for the Chronically Insane in Ovid, New York. Established as a haven in the 19th century, Willard Asylum offered a glimpse of hope for the mentally ill, a sanctuary away from squalid almshouses. President Abraham Lincoln's endorsement paved the way for its creation a mere days before his passing. Patients arrived with harrowing histories, some confined in chicken crates, others shackled since childhood. The institution's architecture mirrored Victorian norms, a sprawling complex divided between genders, equipped with amenities like a bowling alley and even ice baths. Amidst this, treatments like electroshock therapy played out alongside happier pursuits. By 1995, Willard Asylum had discharged its final patient, fading away after an era of change in mental health care. Some of its structures found a new purpose, while others crumbled into disrepair, frozen in time with whispers of its past life. If you're enjoying the videos so far, you can support this channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. At number 9 is the Riverview Hospital in British Columbia, Canada. Woohoo, Canada. Venturing into the heart of British Columbia, we find the enigmatic Riverview Hospital, once a bustling mental asylum, now lost to time. This asylum site sprawls across 247 acres, harboring the echoes of a harrowing history. Dating back to the early 1900s, Riverview's West Lawn Pavilion stands as a sentinel to the past, housing profoundly disturbed male patients until its closure in 1983. Its grandeur, with imposing pillars and a weathered porch, has made it an iconic image of the abandoned complex. Originally designed as a dual haven, the hospital aimed to merge healthcare with botanical splendor. A belief in nature's power to heal was ingrained in this foundation. However, its vision was shifted and Riverview's role as botanical sanctuary was eventually relocated. Within its walls, over 4,300 souls were held in the 1950s. But even as medical progress reduced patient numbers, troubling practices persisted. Shock therapy and alleged illegal sterilizations cast a chilling shadow, with settlements granted to those who suffered in silence. Today, Riverview's eerie corridors whisper stories of trauma, rumored to be a magnet for the supernatural. From its unsettling history to its role as a cinematic backdrop, the Riverview Hospital stands out as a silent sentinel, a portal to the past that still echoes in the present. At number 8 is Sanatorio Duran, located in Cartago. Founded in 1918 and originally established as a tuberculosis hospital by Dr. Carlos Duran, the facility's purpose shifted over time. Despite contrasting accounts, it's confirmed that the doctor's daughter fell victim to the disease after the sanatorium's establishment. Tragically, her demise followed soon after. Operated predominantly by nuns from the Sisters Charity Santa Ana, Sanatorio Duran expanded its scope to accommodate patients with varying conditions, including mental illness. The hospital's role extended beyond healthcare, often becoming an unconventional refuge for society's undesirables, where tuberculosis patients, individuals with mental struggles, and even criminals coexisted. Progress in tuberculosis treatment led to reduced patient numbers by 1960s, with those with mental illnesses transferred to larger psychiatric institutions. As the need for the sanatorium waned, it underwent transformations into an orphanage and a prison, persisting for another decade before its ultimate closure. Decades later, the site bears the marks of time and natural disaster, notably the eruption of the Irazu volcano in 1994. Today, this asylum stands as an eerie testament to its past, earning a reputation as one of Costa Rica's most haunted places.
In our number 7 spot, we have cat sounds. This is a story about a guy who was working as a nurse on a ward when he got talking to one of the patients that he was taking care of. The patient was talking to him about why he was in there and proceeded to tell the nurse that he beat up his cat and it got very injured. When the nurse asked him why he beat up his cat, the guy said that he liked the noises his cat made as he punched him. Oh gosh. In our number 6 spot, we have Baby Doll. This story is told by a nursing assistant that would assist a sweet old lady with dementia in one of the wards. She had other psychological issues too, so that's why she was in there. This old woman believed herself to be a mother, and she had a baby doll that she would hold and believe it to be her child, and each night the nursing assistant would watch her tuck the baby in. She had her own little bed for the baby. She would also think herself to be pregnant at times, and when the baby was due and she wouldn't have the baby, she would get depressed and angry for about a month, until she thought herself to be pregnant again. One night the nursing assistant saw that she had forgotten to tuck her baby in, and so he said that he would help her. The woman punched the assistant right in the throat, and he fell to the floor gasping for air when the woman continued to hit him and say that he was driving too fast and that he destroyed everything she loves. Later on, after this incident, the assistant discovered that the woman had once lost her 1-year-old and husband in a car accident when she was pregnant, and she was so distraught that she ended up giving her baby up for adoption. The assistant felt that it was as if she was in her own personal hell, reliving those memories over and over again. So sad. In our number 5 spot, we have the chemically induced psychosis. This was a story told by a ward assistant that came across a young man who was suffering from an illicit substance-induced psychosis. This patient was taken to this hospital and had been there for over a month with no signs of remission. He had all of the psychotic behaviors while he was in there, but what was horrific to witness was the moments when he would come out of it and popped into reality. He would have a look of sheer terror, and his shaky voice always stuck in this assistant's mind. His family would be so sad and have a hard time visiting him when they did. I really can't imagine how this family must have felt to have to witness this. It's truly very haunting. In our number 4 spot, we have a handful of daisies. This is the story of a woman who was a patient at a ward as she was suffering from psychosis for many years. When she was young, she witnessed the brutal killing of her mother. Apparently, she went missing for a few days and was found completely distraught. Her psychosis got worse over the years, and she would yell and scream the most horrific, sad things every so often. She did have a lot of good days though, where she would be pretty lucid, and she would take a cab to town when all of the staff was distracted with lunch. She would buy herself a handful of daisies and then take a cab back. The staff would be frantically looking for her, of course, when an angry cab driver would pull up demanding to be paid. In our number 3 spot, we have the red shirt man. This story is told by a nurse assistant who was working in a psych ward and was introduced to a very ill man with psychosis. The man was wearing a bright red shirt and looked disheveled. In minutes of meeting him, he had shouted all kinds of profanity at him. He was told to be weary of him. One day he was given the task to check up on him and drop off some food for him. He was reluctant to do so, as most of the staff were afraid of this guy, as he was quite often very aggressive. When he approached his room, he knocked and asked him if he could come in. Silence. He knocked again, and still silence. So he announced that he was coming in regardless. He opened the door to find the man sitting on his bed, cross-legged, wearing his red shirt again, and staring at him with blood running down his nose. He must have hit himself or had done something to injure himself. When the assistant asked if he needed any help, the patient threatened to kill him and said his deceased father was going to help him. He quickly left the room and closed the door and asked to never see that patient again. He was pretty sure that there was some kind of demon inside of him. In our number 2 spot, we have the nightly screams. This is a story about a mental asylum from the early 1900s. This story is told by a woman named Nellie, who stayed in an asylum for 10 days undercover to see what the conditions were like. Apparently, every night she experienced what the nurses called the nightly screams. Screams could be heard every night from some of the same rooms, and some were different. Nellie reported that one night she heard a woman pray and beg for death, while on another night she heard a woman repeatedly shout, "Kill!" Well, that must have been horrific to witness. In our number 1 spot, we have the Spanish demons. One night in a ward while on the night shift, a nurse heard a man freaking out. This man was from South America, and he was known to speak in Spanish from time to time. On this night, he was screaming and yelling about demons coming to get him in Spanish. She tried to do what she could to calm him down, but didn't have much luck, until he just abruptly stopped screaming, and went dead silent. He was looking at something behind the nurse, which completely freaked her out enough to look behind her, and of course nothing was there. But he kept looking until she decided it was time to exit the room. She apparently didn't get much sleep that night, which makes sense. I don't think I would either.
Starting off this countdown, we have the teeth. The first patient on this list did something so gruesome to herself that you may just want to stop eating for a second while I tell the story. So according to the nurse that shared this story, this patient was known for inflicting harm on herself. She was known to rip out all of her hair till there was none left on her head or body. That was one of her habits. One day when they went to go check up on her, they found her with blood all over the floor and blood coming out of her mouth. The patient had pulled out most of her teeth, some of which she actually swallowed. The image of her just sitting in her room, bloody teeth surrounding her, has haunted the nurse ever since. Like, ow! And at number 9, we have the appetite. And guys, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up. Obviously subscribe to our channel because you know what, it really helps us out. So this next patient was placed into a hospital after suffering severe brain damage. She was so bad that she would tend to eat anything around her. She has eaten styrofoam cups, plastic cutlery, plates, and even her clothes. As a result, she was kept in a padded cell with absolutely nothing in it, or else she would try to eat it. One night though, she plucked out one of her eyes. When nurses found her, they wondered where the eye had went. But I'm sure you know where this is going. They later found that she had eaten her own eyeball. This isn't fake, guys. These are real stories. Coming in at number 8, we have Jane. According to this person that shared the story, Jane was a young lady that had a lot going on, but she wasn't diagnosed yet. The first night at the facility, the staff found Jane in her room in a puddle of blood. Turns out that Jane was picking at the skin on her legs. She managed to pull her skin up on her leg and was degloving her own calf. Jane also had other strange habits. Every night before bed, she would perform the same ritual. She would run from wall to wall, touching them in a crucifix pattern. She would do this for hours before finally going to bed. But one night, a worker heard Jane screaming late at night. When he went to go check in on her, she was standing at the doorway smiling. When the staff said, "Jane, what's wrong?" she replied with, "What makes you think you're speaking to Jane?" Yeah, no, that's possession. Jane is gone. That's the devil you're talking to.
In our number 7 spot, we have the patient with the teddy bears. There was once a patient that had a collection of teddy bears. He was a young man and he just loved his teddy bears. It seemed to be completely harmless. Until one day a nurse walked into his room only to find him sitting cross-legged on the floor and all of the bears facing her. The man creepily smiled at her and said, "Their bears are going to eat you." And it's as if there was an echo in the room because he kept saying to her, "Eat you, eat you, eat you," until she got so creeped out that she closed the door and got her co-worker to take over. Apparently the co-worker went into the room to find the man sleeping. Okay, so he was obviously possessed. I may not sleep tonight thinking about this man saying "eat you" over and over again. In our number 6 spot, we have the writings on the bed. This is a story told from the perspective of a nurse that worked on this ward, and he was approached by one of his patients, and she said that she found writings under her bed. Apparently the beds in this ward were held by small wooden bed frames, so someone could have definitely crafted a message on the wood. The nurse wondered what the patient was doing under the bed in the first place, but attested it to something strange and abnormal that he would usually see on this floor. Anyways, one day he went to the patient's room and she showed him the writings, and sure enough, they were there. There were stories written on the wood. After this, somebody went to check all of the beds, and apparently they all had writings on them. Plans of people taking their own lives, stories of their daily life, and who the bad nurses were. It really creeped the nurse out. Honestly, I probably would have written under the bed as well. I remember I did that once when I was young with an old coffee table my family had. It was like a diary after some time had passed, so yeah, I was a special child. In our number 5 spot, we have the Stephen King man. There was once a patient who was in a ward, but also had been struggling with a few other health problems, so he was attached to an oxygen tank, an IV, and a heart monitor. This guy apparently acted as if he was in a Stephen King novel. The volunteer that was working there was sitting with a few patients, including this guy, and this guy mistakenly thought that he was a psychiatrist, probably because he was holding a clipboard. Anyways, the patient started talking to him and asking for his opinion, and the volunteer just kept kept turning it around onto him and asking him what he thought about it. That kind of reminds me of Jamie Lee Curtis in Freaky Friday. And how do you feel about that? Anyways, this seemingly worked until the patient looked at him and said, quote, "You can be the next Messiah. Come here and let me teach you." He insisted that the volunteer sit beside him, but of course he refused and said, "That's okay." Eventually the patient said, "I see." And he began to take off his oxygen mask, his heart monitor, and detach the IV. The volunteer asked him why he was doing this, and the patient said, "I can go now. My task is complete. You will not accept my teaching, and now I can die in peace knowing I tried." A nurse then showed up, and the volunteer quickly made his exit. I hope he updated the nurse, because that sounds pretty scary, and I hope that patient is alright. In our number 4 spot, we have Laughing John. This is a story that is actually told by someone who was once a patient in a psych ward. She was very familiar with the other people staying there, including a man named John. One day she was walking along the corridor when she heard John making really weird noises, laughing and talking to someone in the bathroom with him. She said she waited for him to leave for about 20 minutes, and the noises kept getting louder and louder, so she decided to do something. She opened the door to the bathroom, as they usually aren't locked here, and she saw John on the floor laughing, naked, covered in a pool of blood. He had broken a mirror and had begun to carve deep gashes in his arms and legs. She thought, he was going to die, so she rushed in to help him when he took the mirror shard and sliced her up with it. Her screams are what alerted the staff to come in and restrain him. Apparently days later, she saw him and he had no recollection of the incident. Horrifying. In our number 3 spot, we have the Air Force pilot. This guy, who was newly admitted into a ward, spoke to one of the nurses about his past experiences. He mentioned that he was once a pilot for the Air Force, and he flew experimental planes because his blood was a bit abnormal and could withstand the G-force. Anyways, testing was done that proved this part of the story to be true, as his blood was naturally thin. Anyways, the nurse was at her desk relaying this story to another nurse when a resident started questioning her about it. Apparently, he used to be an Air Force pilot, and the place that this patient was referring to is a top secret place where there are no roads coming in or out of it. It's so secret that you wouldn't know about it unless you've gone there, and that she should not talk about it as she could get herself into trouble. Does that mean I should not talk about it now? Oh well, too late. In any case, I wonder if some experiments were done on this guy and that's why he needed psychiatric help. Crazy to think about what we don't know that might be happening in this world. In our number 2 spot, we have the talking old lady. This is another story told by a patient who was once in a ward. She said that there was once an old lady that was right beside her room, and this old lady was constantly talking to her dead daughter. That's so sad. The older woman would seemingly be comforting her daughter and telling her how much she loved her, until one day something happened and the relationship seemingly took a turn. The old woman got super angry with her and started blaming her for everything, including for why her porridge was burnt, to making her live in such an uncomfortable place. The woman began crying all the time and it was just horrible. The patient asked to change rooms because it was just too dark and sad to hear every single day. So understandable. In our number 1 spot, we have patients predict their own deaths. This is a story told by a nurse that specialized in geriatrics, and apparently she worked for several hospitals for many years. She would often talk about situations that would happen at her work. She would say that each of her patients weirdly tended to have a similar checklist that they would follow right before they were about to die. They would always die in a very similar way. They would talk to someone that wasn't there, usually a previous loved one that had passed away, and when they were asked about what they were talking about, they would say that they were told that they're ready to move on and that they will be taken the next day at a very specific time. Apparently, the patients would often die at the exact time their loved ones had said that they would.
Possessed Jane starts us off in at number 10. Jane was a new patient admitted to a psychiatric wing of a hospital. During the night, a staff member performed her usual nightly routines and checks, but when she went to Jane's room, she saw her sitting in a puddle of blood. As it turns out, Jane had been slicing off her skin on her shin with her dirty fingernails. As she was slicing her skin, she would pull the skin up her leg, which would expose her muscle and bones. I mean, what the heck is going on? Jane also had a nightly routine where she would need to touch every wall in her room in a crucifix pattern. But one night, a staff member went to check up on her and she saw her standing in the doorway smiling. The staff asked her what was wrong and Jane said, "What makes you think you're speaking to Jane?" I mean, oh god, I don't know how people can work the graveyard shift in an insane asylum. Anything can happen. Everyone is a little bit cuckoo. But you know what? I hope that they're getting extra pay. The lost souls of a Rancho Los Amigos brings us to number 9. This hospital is located in Downey, California, and although it looks inviting, it has a very dark and sinister history. Rancho Los Amigos was actually ranked as one of the country's best hospital in 2011, but it is also plagued with scary hauntings and paranormal activity. Back in the late 1800s, the building was converted into an insane asylum. It was built to house the mentally insane, homeless, and handicapped. The residents would work for physical labor in exchange for board and medical care. However, in the 1950s, it began to shut down its wards, including the mental hospital. People began to uncover some pretty disturbing things. In 2006, people found a freezer in the morgue that had mummified amputated limbs and brain tissue samples that were left behind from when the hospital was abandoned. So it makes you wonder what kind of treatments that they were doing here and what happened to these poor people. It is now rumored that this hospital is extremely haunted, and if you care about your mental and physical well-being, you won't step foot inside of the Rancho Los Amigos Hospital. The Athens Lunatic Asylum haunts us in at number 8. This insane asylum was built in 1874, and it was originally intended to treat people with tuberculosis. The hospital staff began abusing their patients due to overcrowding, and they would constantly hurt them both physically and mentally. There was even one doctor by the name of Walter Jackson who was a big fan of this transorbital lumbotomy. Okay, I'm not really sure what it is, but from what I'm seeing, it's pretty damn gross. Like, the doctors were taking this tool and going in between your eyes so that they can work their way into the frontal lobe. It's pretty disturbing and disgusting. So once they were able to get into the frontal lobe, from there, he would sever connections in order to correct their behavior. He performed over 200 lobotomies during his time. So as a result, there were hundreds of deaths that happened here. This hospital was so bad, it even has a permanent corpse stain on the floor because a body had been left there for way too long. Yeah, I don't think Mr. Cleaner or Bleach will help out with this situation.
In our 7th spot, we have The Threat. Honestly, if I worked at any of these places, I don't think I would ever sleep again, especially after hearing this next story. So this next individual worked at a hospital, particularly with older patients. It was around 2:30 in the morning and the staff was going around making sure all the patients were still in their rooms sleeping. But when they approached the room of an 83-year-old woman, they found her sitting straight up in her bed, just staring at the wall. They walked into the room and told her to lie back down and to go to sleep. Then she turned around and said, "They're coming for you, dear." Then she started laughing, like she let out an evil cackle. Afterwards, she lied back down and said, "I'm going to miss you when they take you." Yeah, I wouldn't sleep anymore if that happened to me. Sleep? Yeah, we don't know her. Moving on, number 6, we have the photos. So this story was posted on Reddit by the user Ping. She told the story on behalf of her sister, who is the director of a psychiatric hospital. According to her sister, one of her patients would cut open her arms, legs, and torso. But wait, it gets worse. After doing so, she would take photos of her family and place them under her skin and then close the skin around it. I seriously don't know how the workers do it. Like, I would be traumatized if I saw someone do that. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with The Biter. Reddit user OmniChronos shared the story of one of her patients. So she worked at a juvenile psych unit, and one of the patients she had was very suicidal. and distraught. Because of this, she would tend to bite chunks of skin and flesh out of her own shoulder. She had to be placed in restraints and her head strapped back because of this. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Apparently 3 years later, she was on a bus headed to an interview for a graduate psych program. While on the bus, she was approached by a nicely dressed girl. The girl asked her if she worked at a psych unit. She then went on to say that she was the girl that used to bite the skin off of her shoulders. She was doing completely fine now. Like, that's amazing. I'm so happy that the girl is doing fine. Also, it's pretty cool how they just randomly bumped into each other like 3 years later. In our fourth spot, we have the lost identity. This story starts off with a pretty dark backstory. So this next individual worked at the dental clinic of a psychiatric hospital. One of the patients that she will never forget is a man named Terry. Here's where it gets dark. When Terry was young, he witnessed his sister get killed by their stepfather. As soon as this happened, Terry took on the personality of his sister. He was 100% convinced that he was her. As a result, he would often dress like her. Even now, as a grown man, he would wear little girls' clothing. He would also cut pictures out of little girls and attach them to a string in which he would wear around his neck, like a necklace. Even though the pictures of the girls were random and from magazines, he was convinced that they were his friends. Terry was never violent at all. He was just simply a boy who saw a tragic death at a young age that literally broke him. And that makes me so sad. Poor Terry. Moving on to number 3, we have the carvings in the wall. This next worker was in charge of keeping an eye on a group of certain patients. One of the patients was a pretty shy guy named Tom. He had trouble speaking, so he often would just not speak at all. He had been in the hospital for about a month now and would often keep to himself. What's weird is that he would often sleep on the floor under his bed. Nurses just assumed he might be frightened and that he felt safer sleeping under his bed, so they allowed him to do so. One morning though, the nurse went to check on Tom and found him staring at the wall. His hands were covered in blood. Some of his fingernails were missing. They removed Tom from his room and she inspected the room to see what went down. The nurse followed the trail of blood to under his bed. When she moved the bed, she was horrified at what she saw. Tom had carved a bunch of drawings into the wall with his fingernails. The drawings were satanic. The freakiest part? Tom had written, "He's coming," on the wall, in his blood. Who's coming? The devil, clearly, so get out of there. In our second spot, we have the bones. Just when you thought this list couldn't get any darker, we got this story. Literally, I was scripting this while eating mac and cheese and wrong decision, stop eating. So this next patient had a tendency to harm himself. In particular, his habit was to break his own bones. Now, you would think that would be extremely painful, but for some reason, to him, it wasn't. In fact, he has broken his left arm more than 3 times over the years. Basically, as soon as it heals, he purposely breaks it again. And as a result, his left arm barely functions. When asked why he does this, he told the workers he loves the sounds of bones breaking. He also always has broken fingers and toes. He's just constantly snapping and breaking his bones. Now they have restrained him so that he can't harm himself. But still, I could never imagine breaking my own bones on purpose. It's like the scene in The Orphan when she like puts her arm in the if you've seen that movie, you know what I'm talking about. And in our number 1 spot, we have the eyes. Again, if you're eating something, maybe just put your food away. Just wait until this video's done. Believe me, you won't have an appetite after this. So this story was told by a daughter whose mom worked at a neuropsychiatric ward. One night while she was doing the room checks, she came across a very horrific scene. She turned the corner and saw that a staff member was collapsed on the floor. She immediately started doing CPR and called for help. The staff member had suffered a heart attack after seeing what the patient had done. The patient, who suffered from severe postpartum psychiatric disorder, was just sitting on the floor with her own eyes in her hand. Yeah, she gouged out her own eyes and was just holding them. And while the mom was frantically trying to save her co-worker's life, the patient just sat there calmly, smiling, holding her eyes.